Today is Inauguration Day, and that means that Joe Biden is officially the President of the United States. After running 5 million times and being in the Senate for 180 years, he finally made it. But in this video, I don't want to look at a Joe Biden presidency as much as I don't like that fact. What I want to do is look at the possibility of a Kamala Harris presidency. Because, like it or not, Joe Biden is old, he's kind of senile, and he's on his way out. There is the very real possibility that he won't last 4 terms. I'm not being cynical about this, I'm just trying to be realistic. And no, this is not a Republican talking point. 59% of Americans think it's unlikely that Biden will finish his 4-year term. And even 49% of Democrats agree with that. So I think it's warranted, on this day, which is certainly the best day in Joe Biden's life, at least that he can remember, to instead talk about Kamala Harris. Because she is much more radical and much more extreme than Joe Biden ever was. And she is plagued by scandals in her past that people aren't really talking about nearly as much as they should. She does not deserve to be vice president. As much as I don't like Joe Biden, Kamala Harris as a possible president disturbs me even more. So let's jump right in and find out how much you don't know about Kamala Harris. To begin with, she studied political science and economics at Howard University and eventually graduated from Hastings College with a law degree in 1989. After that, she worked as a deputy district attorney for a number of years. But in that same time frame, she was also appointed to the California Medical Assistance Commission in 1994, where she would earn $120,000 in today's money. And the person who appointed her was Willie Brown, who would later become the mayor of San Francisco. Now, it's not really unheard of to be on this commission, even though you have no medical experience whatsoever, but it is a little bit weird that Kamala Harris was appointed to a commission that meets 2 times a month and makes $120,000 a year when most of the other people on the commission are retired or at least semi-retired. And Kamala Harris was kind of just beginning her career. So it's obvious that this was a political appointment given as a favor. And what makes this even more obvious is that at the time, Kamala Harris, who was 30, was dating Willie Brown, the person who appointed her to this commission, even though he was 60 years old, and yes, he was married at the time. To be fair, he and his wife had been separated for a number of years, but he was still married. And as a bit of an aside, he is to this day still separated from his wife, but they're not actually divorced. So I'm not entirely sure what's going on there. You've been separated for decades, you might as well just get a divorce, but whatever. The fact of the matter is that there's a conflict of interest here. Kamala Harris was dating a guy who gave her an appointment to this commission where she made $120,000 a year in today's money. A number of years later, Kamala Harris became the district attorney for San Francisco. And I'm sure that her relationship with Willie Brown, who was then the mayor of San Francisco, didn't really hurt anything. And while she was a district attorney, there were a number of scandals in her office, including a crime lab scandal that she kind of just brushed under the rug and tried to blame other people. Essentially what happened is that one of Harris's top deputies had emailed a colleague talking about a crime lab technician who was increasingly undependable for testimony. They didn't do anything about it, and a few weeks later, that technician took home cocaine from the lab, which is not something a lab technician should do. Obviously, this was kind of a big deal, and a Superior Court judge criticized Harris for, quote, failing to disclose information that clearly should have been disclosed. As a matter of fact, this article from the Washington Post says that if you review the court proceedings, it shows a portrait of Harris scrambling to manage a crisis that her staff saw coming, but which she was unprepared. So they kind of knew it was going to happen, or at least something was going to happen, because they'd emailed about it, but they ignored it, didn't tell anybody, and then the crime lab technician essentially tainted perhaps hundreds of cases. And because Kamala Harris was a great district attorney, you just know that she took responsibility for this, and she said that they would work to make sure it never happened again. Of course that's not what happened. She tried to pass the buck and blame everyone else. She tried to blame the cops, and she also blamed the judge who criticized her, saying that she was just being biased. And this is a fairly common practice of Kamala Harris. Rather than taking responsibility for the mistakes that she makes or her office makes, she tries to blame other people. And we'll see it a little bit later as well. And while she was still the district attorney, she also began prosecuting parents if their children miss school too often. And she threatened them with jail time. Now, I would argue that threatening to imprison parents if their children don't go to school is pretty bad policy. That's not really fixing the underlying condition here. But you know, why should we think about that when you can laugh about arresting parents?
So I decided I was going to start prosecuting parents for truancy. Well, this was a little controversial in San Francisco.
Now, the Los Angeles Times writes that no parents were actually jailed under Kamala Harris's proposal, but that obviously doesn't excuse the threat that was looming over their heads in the first place. And for some reason, the state Senate decided to pass a bill very similar to this, applying to the entire state. A bill that Harris sponsored. It was modeled on her truancy initiative in San Francisco, and that bill did in fact result in some parents being jailed. And again, in response to criticism to this bill, Kamala Harris tried to laugh it off, saying that that wasn't the intention to imprison parents, but it kind of was, as this article correctly points out. Now, in spite of the scandals that we already looked at when she was the district attorney, in 2011 she somehow became the attorney general for the state of California. I don't know why they chose her based on the things we've already seen, but it's about to get significantly worse. For example, her office, when she was the attorney general, tried to keep inmates locked up to use them as cheap labor. And this is coming from the Daily Beast, who is, not a right-wing publication. Essentially what happened is that in 2011, the Supreme Court looked at the California prisons and said they were overpopulated. So much so that it constituted cruel and unusual punishment. Now, I'm not generally someone who is a huge advocate of releasing people en masse from prisons, but in this case, I think it was somewhat warranted. Because, for example, there were prisons that were at 200% their design capacity, 54 prisoners had to share a single toilet, and preventable deaths due to substandard and overstretched medical care occurred every 5 to 6 days. So looking at all of that, I do think the Supreme Court was warranted in saying that California has to make some changes, because they were overpopulated and people were literally dying because of this. So Kamala Harris once again chose to not really respond or do much of anything because that's who she is. Instead, Kamala Harris's office argued that if certain potential parolees were given a faster track out of prison, it would negatively affect the prison's labor programs, including one that allowed certain inmates to fight California's wildfires for about $2 a day. Now, at first glance, this might look like Kamala Harris was just keeping people in prison to use them as cheap labor, but she was actually probably just looking out for the prisoners. I mean, why would you want them to go free and have a normal life and get at least a minimum wage job when they can stay in the comfort and security of a prison and get $2 a day trying to fight wildfires? I mean, it's kind of a toss-up which of those is a better option. So Kamala Harris was just making sure they had the opportunity to stay in a secure and happy environment, I suppose. And if we continue with this whole idea of prisoners, we can now look at the case of Daniel Larson. So he had been in prison for 11 years. And the California Innocence Project actually found enough evidence to prove that he was innocent. So much so that a judge ordered that he be released. But 2 years later, he was still in prison. Now, why is that the case? You would think that if a judge ordered someone to be released because they had evidence that he was innocent, then he would actually be, released from prison. Because for 2 years, an innocent man, who they knew to be innocent, was in prison. So why did Kamala Harris's office keep him in prison? Well, Kamala Harris argued that even if Danny was innocent, his conviction should not be reversed because he waited too long to file his petition. So in other words, there's no problem with keeping an innocent man in prison if he filed his paperwork a little bit too late. Which reminds me a little bit of this character from Monsters, Inc. And I guess that's who Kamala Harris is. And let's look at one more prisoner who Kamala Harris treated very unfairly. His name is Kevin Cooper, and he had been in prison since 1983. And just like Daniel Larson, even though there was a lot of evidence suggesting that Kevin Cooper was innocent, Kamala Harris didn't seem to really care that much. As a matter of fact, Kamala Harris and other Democrats in the state refused to allow newly available DNA testing, which could very possibly prove his innocence. And once again, this happened while she was the Attorney General for the state of California. So yeah, she's kind of responsible for this if her office passed and refused to allow DNA testing. He had been in prison for decades, but that's not important because they wanted him to stay in prison for some reason. And as a little bit of an aside, you better believe that if Kamala Harris were white, then we would not stop hearing about how racially motivated this entire scandal was. But because she's black, I suppose she kind of gets a pass on this. And sure, some people are talking about it, like this article right here for the New York Times, but at the same time, it didn't stop her from becoming the Vice President of the United States, so how much pushback really can there have been? In response to these scandals, Kamala Harris has basically one thing to say. There are cases where there were folks that made a decision in my office and they had not consulted me, and I wish that they had. So it's not her responsibility what people in her office do, it's their responsibility. And she is in no way responsible for any of the things that we've talked about thus far. Even though Vox rightfully points out that Harris could have changed department policy and become more hands-on because these scandals kept happening. Time and time again, you think something would have to change, but I guess not. And I suppose they didn't need to change because she became senator in 2016. And as a matter of fact, she was the most liberal member of the Senate if you look at her voting record. This is something that CNN tried to say was false, but even they had to admit that it was true. They said Harris's voting record in the Senate is certainly one of the most liberal, though her record prior to the Senate is more moderate on some issues. Moderate meaning that she kept people in prison for no reason other than she wanted to use them as cheap labor, or she didn't want them to be innocent because of paperwork or something. Sounds moderate to me. As an example of one of her liberal bills while she was in the Senate, consider the Family-Friendly Schools Act. It sounds like a good bill based on the name alone, but it's really not, because what Kamala Harris wanted to do was extend the school day from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. Monday through Friday. And if you do the math on that, that means that Kamala Harris wanted to have students in school for 10 hours every single day, or 50 hours every week. Most Americans recognize that we do have a problem with our educational system. That's not to say that every school is broken, but as a whole, the educational system in America is pretty much broken. So why would you then want to have students in that system for even longer? If it's a broken system, if it's not working, extending the school day is not going to improve anything. It might actually make it worse. But in spite of bills like that, Kamala Harris felt that somehow she could become president in 2020, after being in the Senate for only a couple of years. Now, it's not unheard of for this to happen. Barack Obama is a pretty good example, but not everyone can be Barack Obama. And I don't like the guy, but you have to admit that compared to Kamala Harris, he is way more charismatic and way more likable. Kamala Harris just doesn't really have that appeal. So the fact that she thought she could run for president and win is a little bit amusing to me. And she didn't win at all. It was kind of really bad, actually. Let's look at some of her policies, though, while she was trying to run for president, starting with how she wanted to hold corporations accountable for pay inequality in America. She starts with the very debunked statistic that women earn just 80 cents on average for every dollar paid to men. And then she says that she, Kamala Harris, is going to fix that. And she'll do it by mandating that corporations have an equal pay certification provided to them by the federal government. And if you don't have one of those certificates, what happens to you? Well, you pay a tax. Under our plan, companies that fail to receive equal pay certification will face a fine for every day they discriminate against their workers. Now, there are a lot of problems with this. First off, pay discrimination in this sense doesn't really exist. Men aren't paid more just because they're men, and women aren't paid less just because they're women. There are plenty of things at play here. But if pay discrimination did exist, and you saw that your corporation was actually discriminated against you because of your gender, well, you have a lawsuit there. We don't need the federal government to come in and look at Amy and see that she's being paid less than Dave, and so there must be discrimination, and so the company is going to have to pay for it. In my opinion, that's a huge overreach of the federal government. But she doesn't really seem to care about the power of the federal government because she laughed about the Constitution, and she's fine if we do things that are completely unconstitutional, as long as it's something that she wants to do, such as gun confiscation.
Biden saying there's no constitutional authority to issue that executive order when they say I'm going to eliminate assault weapons. Does the vice president have a point there?
Some things you can, many things you can't.
Let's let the senator answer.
Oh, I mean, I would just say, hey, Joe, instead of saying no, we can't, let's say yes, we can.
Let's be constitutional. We got a constitution.
And yes, we can.
I remember when I saw this during the debate, it was pretty disturbing. Even Joe Biden recognizes that that was unconstitutional. But Kamala Harris, who needs the Constitution? Let's just say we can override the Constitution because, Kamala Harris wants to. Because of things like that, she fortunately did not become president of the United States. She had to drop out of the race because she was doing very horribly. When she dropped out, she had about 3.4% support nationally, which is, not very good. And for a very brief time, I thought maybe we were done with Kamala Harris. I wouldn't have to see or really talk about her again. And it was a happy and blissful time. But unfortunately, that bubble was broken when she was chosen as Biden's VP, which I don't think was a good choice. Early last year, Joe Biden vowed to pick a woman as his vice president, which I guess is okay. He's just kind of appealing to the voters, I suppose. But Democrats didn't even think that was enough. They urged him to choose not just a woman, but the first woman of color as a running mate. Choosing someone based on their sex, that's not good enough. It has to be based on their sex and based on their race. You have to have both of the things. And this is where intersectionality is really dangerous. I'm obviously not trying to say that someone who is a woman or a black woman or a woman of color is not qualified to be vice president, but I am saying if you limit who you're picking based on their race and their gender, by definition and statistically speaking, you're going to have a much less qualified pool of applicants because you're disregarding the vast majority of the population. And that's what happened here. Kamala Harris was chosen essentially because of her race and because of her gender. Keep in mind that she dropped out of the race before any of the primaries and had only 3% support. Joe Biden didn't need her support. She wasn't helping him really in any way, shape, or form. But in spite of all of that, Joe Biden picked her. Now, I can guarantee you that if she were not a woman of color, he wouldn't have chosen her. But, that's how it happened. And while all of this was going on, I lost a bit of respect for Amy Klobuchar. Granted, I didn't have a ton of it to begin with, but I thought that she would have been a much better pick as president or even vice president. But that's not what happened, and when Biden was picking his vice president, she actually withdrew her name from consideration, saying that he should pick a woman of color. Which I already talked about why I don't like that and why I think she just kind of caved to intersectionality. So now you know quite a bit more about Kamala Harris. You know where she came from, a lot of the scandals that plague her past, and for some reason we don't really hear about anymore. Even though she is the Vice President of the United States, and her blaming her employees and the cops and keeping people in prison for virtually no reason should kind of be important, we don't need to talk about that because she's a woman of color, and she's the first woman of color Vice President. That's all that matters. And all of these things is why I am deeply disturbed at the possibility of her becoming the next president of the United States. So if you've made it this far, make sure you subscribe, leave a like, and let me know what you think about the possibility of a Kamala Harris presidency. As I said at the beginning, I truly believe that her presidency, or the possibility of her presidency, would be much worse than a Joe Biden presidency. But let me know if you agree. If you think Biden would be better or worse, just let me know in the comments down below. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.